Hey guys, what's up? Ruben here from the Midnight Garage. So most of you guys have probably toyed around with the idea to put a turbo in your car at one point or another, but you might not know exactly what it takes to turbo your car. And just for you guys, I've made this video. Now, as you can expect, there are a whole lot of aspects that you have to take care of when turboing a car, and talking about everything properly would probably mean that this video is going to be several hours long. So I am going to simplify a couple of things so we can cover as much ground in the shortest amount of time possible. So if you are a turbo expert and you know everything about turboing a car already, then this video is not for you, but please feel free to watch it anyways and post some additional information in the comments so that the people that actually want to learn about turboing their car have some more information. I don't know about you guys, but I think it would be pretty nice if we can use the comment section to help each other out if you're planning to turbo your car, right? Alright guys, so first up, two things. One, this is a turbo kit that belongs to Case. That's his Greddy turbo kit, and I will be using it as an example throughout the video. I can highly recommend you guys taking the turbo kit as well, a complete turbo kit that you can buy as a kit somewhere on eBay, for example. There are two versions, basically the cheap China turbo kits and the proper turbo kits like the Greddy one, like this one, for example. It doesn't really matter in my opinion. I've seen people that bought China kits that, well, actually end up being really good. And I've also seen people that basically got a China turbo kit where they had to replace the turbo and the exhaust manifold, and they had a lot of issues with it. If you are going to get a Chinese kit, well, you're going to save yourself a lot of money, but it may be more expensive in the long run. But that's basically a risk you're going to have to take. The second thing that I wanted to say is that although a turbo kit is very cost efficient in terms of money you've spent versus horsepower you gain, it's still very expensive, and unless you're very lucky, you're going to look at least $1,000 and more likely somewhere towards $2,000. So that's something to keep in mind if you're going to turbo your car. Alright guys, with that all out of the way, let's talk about all the aspects related to a turbo conversion. Now, first up, I am going to talk about the things that are, in my opinion, 100% needed to do a turbo conversion. Your opinion might change a little bit if you're into turbos, but this is just my personal preference. And then once we're done with that, I'm going to talk about a few things that you don't really need, in my opinion, but definitely make your life a whole lot easier if you're going to turbo your car. Alright, so first up, in order to actually install your turbo, you're going to need a turbo header like this, for example. If you are going to buy a turbo kit, then it's pretty easy, as you already will have a header that fits your car. If not, there are a couple of things that you need to pay attention to. There are several types of turbo manifolds, but they can each be classified in basically two categories, and that's log type and tubular. Log type manifolds have two advantages. The first one is that they are really small and therefore they're very easy to install in combination with power steering and air conditioning and whatnot. And the second one is that they're usually made out of cast iron, and therefore they're not as easy to crack as the tubular design. The biggest drawback of a log type manifold, however, is that because of the runners are not of equal length, the pulses do not reach turbo at consecutive times, and therefore you will have a loss of power. So in short, log type manifolds are stronger, smaller, but they're not the best ones for power. Tubular manifolds come in many shapes and sizes, such as, for example, a ram-horn manifold and a top mount manifold. These manifolds usually have in common that the runners are of equal length, and therefore the turbo spools up better and you will get an increased performance over the log type manifolds. Their biggest drawback, however, is that they are a whole lot bigger than the log type manifolds, and because of the welded design, they're usually more prone to cracking in comparison to a log type manifold. So they are less reliable, but they will give you better power. Well, a couple of things to keep in mind if you're going to purchase or build a manifold is that the first thing is that the thicker pipes will increase the top end power, but it will also increase the lag. Secondly, this turbo has an internal wastegate, but if you have an external wastegate, then you will need to have a manifold that is compatible with an external wastegate. Also, twin scroll turbos need twin scroll manifolds. Next up, we have the turbo itself. If you're unfamiliar with the turbo, I will give you guys a really quick summary. Exhaust gases come out of the car. They will power a wheel in the turbo itself, which is connected to another wheel on the intake side. This wheel in turn forces more air into the engine, and that in turn will go out of the engine again and power the turbo again, etc, etc. If you buy a ready-made turbo kit for your car, it will already come with a turbo that suits your engine, so that's really easy. If you buy an eBay turbo kit, your turbo might either be good or bad, and that's basically a risk you should be willing to take if you do so. You can of course also put everything together yourself, and you can find your own turbo. Now, if you're going to do that, my best advice is to just buy a turbo that most people use when turboing your car, especially if it's your first build, as experimenting could be better, but most likely not. And the turbo that most people use usually is the best one. Also, if you stick with the turbo that most people use when turboing your car, then you will have the most aftermarket support in terms of flanges of manifolds and downpipes. Most turbos are either oil cooled or oil and water cooled, and if you have an oil cooled turbo like this one, then you need an oil feed and an oil return line. The oil feed usually is the easiest one of the two, as you can simply use a sandwich plate like this and you can install it behind your oil filter. The oil return line is slightly more difficult than the oil feed, as most people end up welding a bung into the sump and basically having a line from the turbo to the bung in the sump. If your turbo happens to be water cooled as well, then the easiest way to go about it is to plumb it in line with one of the water coolant related hoses that run through your intake manifold. If you have an older car, you can also block off the entire intake related coolant system and just use the feed and return line to cool the turbo. That way you will get a minor performance increase boost, but it will be only minor. Now that we've discussed the turbo, we can discuss the downpipe and the rest of the exhaust. Now with the downpipe that's of a larger diameter, you will get an increased amount of spool, as the turbo can get rid of its gases more easily and more quickly, and therefore you will get more power and a faster spool, so you will get your power sooner. Same goes for the exhaust. In 99% of the cases, a larger diameter exhaust will result in more horsepower. Now you might think that this is rather strange coming from a car guy, but I'm personally not a big fan of loud exhausts. But fortunately with the turbo itself dampens the sound slightly, and therefore you can have a larger diameter exhaust without having too much noise in comparison to a natural aspirated engine. Alright, so we've discussed the exhaust side of the turbo and the turbo itself, but obviously if you do not hook up the turbo to your intake manifold, your turbo system will not work. So you need some piping to hook everything up. And once you're done, it looks a little something like this. Now the idea behind it is actually pretty simple. You have an air filter that leads to the turbo, then from the turbo it leads to an intercooler, and then from the intercooler it goes all the way to your intake. Now the intercooler is optional, obviously. So in theory you could just lead a pipe from here to there and you should be done. But obviously we're all car guys and we want a big ass intercooler sticking out of our front bumper, right? An intercooler is basically a radiator and it cools the air going to your intake, and a lower intake air temperature means more power. And the same what applied to the exhaust manifold applies to the intake piping, and that's a larger diameter of piping means that you have more power but also more lag. Same goes for the intercooler. Larger intercooler means more top end power but more lag. And a perfect setup basically is different, but if you buy a turbo kit for your car you usually have a pretty good setup for a basic turbo. Also this intake piping route is rather long, and if you find a way to shorten it you will increase the power as well. I will give you guys a small example if I had the intake piping on my old Toyota Supra, so I will give you guys an example of how, if you're planning to do this yourself. I had the turbo, and I had basically a feed from the hood that fed into the turbo. Then I had the turbo piping that went to an intercooler that was flat like here, because I had a V-mount intercooler system, so that means that the radiator and the intercooler had a separate air channel. And then from here to the intake, so I basically had 2 feet of intake and that's about it. So I had a really short system with a large intercooler, so I had pretty big spool and hardly any lag. And now we get to the blow-off valve. A blow-off valve, in my opinion, is not needed for a basic turbo setup, but since pretty much anyone that wants turbo, not for its power but because of the sound, does it for a blow-off valve, I will include it. A blow-off valve works as follows. Basically you're driving around, you have your turbo spooling up, and suddenly you lift off your gas and the throttle body closes. When the throttle body closes, it means that the turbo still spools up, there's a lot of air in the system, and suddenly it can't go anywhere since your throttle body is closed. That means it will go back. If you don't have a blow-off valve, it will go all the way back to the turbo, and it will basically stall the turbo. And that means that it has to spool up again if you're going to drive again, and that will also decrease the wear. So having a blow-off valve, that means that as soon as the air comes back from the throttle body, it will blow the excess air off, and therefore that means that your turbo keeps spooling and you will have less lag when you drive around. There are 2 types of blow-off valves. You have a recirculating one, which is rather silent, and you have an atmospheric one, which is the one you usually hear. I'm not going to go into detail too much, but if you have a MAF system, I can recommend a recirculating one. And if you have a MAP system like most Hondas do, then you can get an atmospheric one. You can also run an atmospheric blow-off valve with a MAF sensor, but then sometimes your engine will run too rich unless you've chipped it for it. For the best effect, you can install a blow-off valve as close to the throttle body as possible. So if it were any better, it would have been somewhere here. Hooking up a blow-off valve is rather simple as well, as it only needs to know the difference between the manifold and the intake, so you need one hose going to the intake and one hose going to the manifold. Alright, so you've hooked everything up and you want to start your car and see if everything works. But you know, don't. Because if you do it like this, then most likely your computer will completely freak out and will throw some error codes and you will do some damage. You see, most ECUs have a sensor that measures the vacuum in your intake manifold, and basically with the vacuum it calculates how much fuel it needs to put in the engine in order for it to run properly. But instead of vacuum, it now reads boost, and that means that your ECU gets completely confused and will probably not work properly anymore. So that means that you have to chip your car. This costs some extra money, but I can highly recommend it. There are some ways to fool the ECU to thinking that you have vacuum, like a missing link for example, but I cannot recommend them at all, and I can highly recommend you chipping your car. If your car has OBD1, then you're lucky and you can easily chip them. If your car is not OBD1 and it's possible to convert it to OBD1, I can highly recommend that, because that will save you a whole lot of trouble. And also converting a car to OBD1, if possible, is not really that expensive. Another way is to go with a standalone ECU, which works even better, but that's a whole lot more expensive. Also, if you have a carburetor instead of an ECU, it's possible to turbo it as well, but you either need a carburetor that's ready for turbo or you need to modify your carburetor for it to accept forced induction. Alright, so far the things that you definitely need in my opinion. Now, let's talk a bit about the things that I can highly recommend. First up, an uprated clutch. There's no clutch on this engine, but just pretend that there's one here, okay? You don't really need a clutch per se, because your turbo setup will run with or without a better clutch. You will probably wear out your clutch really soon if you don't upgrade it. And you don't really need to get a racing clutch unless you're going to go high boost, but something that can handle the horsepower slightly better is highly recommended. Another item that I can definitely recommend is a set of larger injectors. Now, you don't really need one 100% per se, especially if you're going to stick to low boost, but it's highly recommended to just go for some uprated injectors. You won't need to, but if you have the cash to spare, I would definitely recommend getting some new injectors. Especially if you're planning to go on higher boost in the future, it's good to already have made the upgrade beforehand. And if you're going to do so before you are going to chip your car and not after. Another something that I can definitely recommend getting for your turbo build is a boost controller. Now, you don't really need a boost controller per se, but sometimes you probably wish you had slightly more boost, and a boost controller would be very handy. Now, you have a manual one, which is rather easy and is super cheap, and you have an electronic one, which is rather expensive. I personally prefer the electronic ones, but which one you should get is up to you. Another way for you to slightly alter the boost is to shim the wastegate so it opens later. But still, I can definitely prefer a manual boost controller or an electronic one. Another something that you don't really need 100%, but I can still highly recommend, is an oil catch can. Because if you're going to drive with a turbo, you're going to have increased oil blow by, and having an oil catch can to catch shit and not make a big of a mess is slightly better. Now, next up on the list of stuff you don't really need for your turbo build, but I can highly recommend, is a set of gauges. Now, the first gauge that I can recommend is a boost gauge, so you can keep an eye out on the boost levels of your engine. And then next, I would also recommend oil pressure, oil temperature and water temperature, so you can at least see if your engine is performing well or not. Another something that I can highly recommend, even though you don't really need it, is a larger radiator, because your engine will be under a lot more stress and some added cooling will be greatly beneficial for your engine. And then some things that you don't really need in my opinion. First up, some colder spark plugs. These should lower the temperature in your detonation chamber, but in my opinion, if you just get some new spark plugs, some original ones, that should be fine as well, unless you're going for really high boost. But for a first turbo kit, I would just go for a low boost setup. The next thing that I don't really think is all that important is a high flow fuel rail, as most fuel rails on most cars are sufficient for a low boost setup. Now, there are some cars out there that can definitely benefit a larger fuel rail, but 99% of the time you don't really need it. Another something you don't really need for your turbo setup is an adjustable fuel pressure regulator. Now, some tuners will say that they do prefer to have an adjustable one so they can adjust the fuel pressure and act accordingly, but that depends on the tuner, and would definitely, if you don't have the cash for it, definitely discuss it with the tuner before purchasing one. And that's pretty much it for a turbo conversion. Now, obviously you can make it even more crazy by, for example, building your entire engine for lower compression so you can run even more boost, but that's something for another video. One thing I can definitely recommend if this is your very first car build or your very first turbo build, and that's don't overdo it, don't get too much parts, just get the basics that you need to turbo your car, turbo it, and then once everything's up and running properly, then you can continue looking for more things that you can do. Because if you're going to do too much at once and it doesn't work, there's going to be so much things that probably could go wrong. So if you're gonna make it a little bit easier for yourself, just get the least amount of parts that are needed for your own turbo conversion. But hey, that's up to you. Anyways, that's the video for today. I hope you guys liked it. Leave a like if you did and hit the subscribe button if you want to see more videos like this, and then hopefully we'll see you guys in the next one. Bye.